The fifth time, my daughter's fiancé asked about the lake house. I stopped laughing it off. The first time, I thought he was just making conversation. We were sitting out on the back porch after Sunday dinner, the kind of late October evening, where the air smells like wood smoke and old leaves, and he leaned back in his chair and said, "So how many acres does the property run? Just the lot, or does it go back past the tree line?" I told him it went back about 40 acres to the creek. He nodded like he was filing it away somewhere. The second time, he brought it up on a Tuesday, called me directly, which surprised me. We didn't really have that kind of relationship yet. Said he'd been thinking about the property tax situation in that county and wondered if I'd ever looked into a conservation easement. I told him I hadn't. He said it might be worth exploring, that there were some real financial advantages to that kind of arrangement. I thanked him and hung up feeling like I'd had a conversation I hadn't quite understood. My daughter had been seeing him for about 8 months at that point. She was 31, a physical therapist at a clinic in Asheville, and she'd met him at a friend's birthday party in the spring. He was 38, introduced himself as a private wealth advisor. Handsome in a way that made you think he'd always known he was handsome. Polo shirts pressed just so. Laughed at exactly the right moments. He drove a car that was nice enough to notice, but not so nice that it seemed reckless. The third time he asked about the lake house, it was Christmas. We were all there together, my daughter, her fiancé, my son and his wife, my son-in-law's parents, who had driven up from Savannah, big table, my wife's mother's china that I'd wrapped carefully every year since my wife passed. My daughter had put holly around the candles, the same way her mother used to. I was carving the ham when he said, casually, to no one in particular, "I keep telling him that lake property is a real asset. A lot of people don't understand what they're sitting on." I looked at him across the table. He smiled at me and said, "I just mean you've done well for yourself. You should be proud." My daughter laughed and said, "Dad, he's been obsessed with that property since he saw it in the fall." I smiled too, but my wife's mother's china looked very fragile all of a sudden, sitting there on the table. Let me tell you a little about that lake house, because it matters. My wife and I bought it in 1989 for $42,000. It was a wreck. A cabin, really, wood-paneled walls, a propane stove, a dock that slanted so badly you couldn't walk on it without grabbing the railing. We spent every summer weekend for 3 years fixing it up ourselves. My wife stained the deck boards in her swimsuit while I fought with the plumbing. Our children learned to swim off that dock. My daughter had her first birthday party there when she turned 7, and I have a photograph of her on the dock in a paper crown looking completely unimpressed by the whole thing, and I love that photograph more than almost anything I own. My wife got sick in 2018. She passed in the spring of 2020, 2 weeks into the pandemic, which meant we couldn't have the kind of funeral she deserved. My daughter came home and stayed with me for 3 weeks. We sat on the porch of that lake house. We couldn't go anywhere else, and we just talked, for hours, about her mother, about nothing, about the time a family of raccoons got into the propane tank and my wife chased them off the dock in her bathrobe at 2 in the morning, and was furious and laughing at the same time. That lake house is not a real estate asset. That lake house is everything that's left. After Christmas, I started paying attention differently. I went back and thought about the calls, the comments, the careful questions. He'd asked about the deed structure once. Just offhand, just curious, and whether I'd ever thought about restructuring for estate purposes. He'd mentioned a trust vehicle that could, quote, protect the property and create some liquidity at the same time. I hadn't thought much of any of it individually, but when I laid them all end to end, they started to look like something with a shape. I want to be careful here because I know what I could be accused of. He was going to marry my daughter. He had a right to know about the family's financial situation. Plenty of future sons-in-law take an interest in that kind of thing. I know all of that. I told myself all of that many times, in that first week of January when I was trying to decide what to do. But I've been an electrician for 35 years. I spent 3 decades rewiring old houses, tracing faults through walls and ceilings, learning to follow a circuit back to its source. And I knew what it felt like when something was drawing too much current. Something was pulling at me, faint but steady. And I'd learned a long time ago not to ignore that. I called my brother. He's 2 years older than me, lives in Knoxville, retired now from a career in commercial insurance. He spent the better part of 40 years evaluating risk for a living. I told him what I'd noticed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know what that sounds like?" I said I wasn't sure. He said, "It sounds like someone trying to figure out how to get his name on something." I didn't sleep well that night. I didn't want to hire anyone. That felt like a betrayal of my daughter, of the possibility that I was wrong, of the version of the future where this man was just eager and a little awkward about money. But 2 days later, my brother called back and said he had a contact, a woman he'd worked with on fraud cases for insurance companies, who did private investigations on the side. He said she was discreet and thorough, and she didn't charge for an initial consultation. Her name was Nessa, and she met me at a coffee shop in downtown Knoxville on a Thursday morning in January. She was maybe 45, practical clothes, a notebook, a cup of black coffee. She asked me to tell her everything in order. I did. She wrote for a long time after I stopped talking. Then she said, "Do you have his full legal name?" I did. My daughter had put him on the rehearsal dinner invitation list, and I'd seen it there. His full name, the name of the city he was from originally, his professional credentials, certified financial planner. I'd looked it up once, and it had seemed legitimate. Nessa said she'd be in touch. She called me 9 days later. I was out in the garage when my phone rang, sanding down a cabinet door I'd been meaning to refinish since September. I turned off the sander and picked up. She said, "I need you to sit down for a minute." I pulled over a stool. She told me that she'd found 3 prior complaints filed against him with the CFP board, a regulatory body that oversees certified financial planners. 2 had been dismissed. 1 had resulted in a formal censure that was not prominently displayed in his public record. All 3 complaints came from older clients, 2 of them widows. In each case, the complaint had involved an allegation that he'd steered them toward complex financial instruments, some involving property, that had primarily benefited him or affiliated entities. I sat there in the garage with my hand on the cabinet door. She wasn't done. She'd gone further back, to a city he'd lived in before Asheville. She'd found a civil suit there, 7 years ago. A woman in her late 60s had sued him for misappropriation. She alleged he'd convinced her to put her vacation property into a holding company he controlled, and then had made it extremely difficult for her to recover it. The suit had been settled out of court. The terms were sealed. She said, "He's done this before. I can't tell you definitively what his intentions are with your daughter, but the pattern is there." I said, "What pattern exactly?" She said, "Wealthy widow or widower, significant property, close relationship, often romantic, gradual effort to restructure how the asset is held. The property ends up in an entity that he has significant control over, and then things get complicated." The garage was very quiet. Outside, I could hear a truck going by on the road. I said, "My daughter is not a widow." She said, "No, but you are, and the property is in your name." I had to put the phone down on the workbench for a moment. When I picked it back up, she said, "I'm sorry. I know this is a lot." I said, "What do I do?" She said that was up to me. She said I could bring it to my daughter directly with the documentation. She said I could consult an attorney first. She said I could also wait and see if he made any more direct moves. She said all 3 were reasonable approaches, and that none of them were easy. After I hung up, I sat in the garage for a long time. The cabinet door was right there in front of me, half sanded, the grain starting to show through the old paint. My wife had picked out that cabinet at a salvage yard in 1994. She had a genius for seeing what things could become. I didn't know how to tell my daughter. That is the honest truth of it. I had the evidence. I had the documentation. I had a private investigator who would testify to her methodology and her findings. And I sat on it for 3 weeks because I did not know how to tell my daughter that the man she was going to marry in April had a history of doing exactly this kind of thing, and that I believed, I couldn't prove, but I believed, that he had been looking at her partly as a vehicle for getting to me. I thought about my wife every single day during those 3 weeks. I thought about what she would have said. My wife was the kind of person who went straight at things. She did not circle problems. She did not build elaborate approaches. She would have said, I could hear her voice saying it, "You sit that girl down and you tell her what you know. She can be angry later. Right now she needs to know." But I was scared. Not of him, of losing my daughter. She called me in early March to talk about the wedding seating chart. We were on the phone for 45 minutes working out where to seat her fiancé's college roommates relative to my brother's family, and she was laughing and a little stressed, and she said, "Daddy, I cannot believe how complicated this is. How did you and Mom ever do it?" And I said I honestly didn't remember. And she laughed again, and I almost told her right then. Almost. The wedding was April 19th, a Saturday. She'd been planning it for almost a year. The venue was a restored barn outside of Brevard. She'd found it on her own, driven out there one afternoon, and called me from the parking lot because she was so excited. 200 guests, a bluegrass band, a caterer she'd been visiting for months because she wanted to make sure the food was right. She is her mother's daughter in every way that matters. The Thursday before the wedding, I drove to Brevard and checked into a hotel. I had a folder in my bag with everything Nessa had given me. I also had an appointment the next morning with a family law attorney my brother had found because I wanted to understand exactly what I was walking into before I walked into it. The attorney was a careful, direct woman who had been practicing for 25 years. I spread the documents on her conference table, and she went through them methodically, asking questions, making notes. When she was done, she said to me, "None of this is criminal, as it stands. The pattern is concerning, the civil suit history is significant, but there's nothing here that you could take to the police today and have him arrested for." I said I understood that. She said, "But I want you to understand something else. If your daughter marries this man, and he then begins working on you to restructure that property, and based on what you're showing me, he will be doing it as your son-in-law. That changes the social dynamics in ways that can make it very difficult to say no. It changes the family pressure that comes to bear. And if he does get his name on that property in any form, recovering it becomes a significant legal battle." I said, "What would you do if it was your daughter?" She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I'd tell her before the wedding." I drove back to the hotel. I sat in the parking lot for a while. Then I called my daughter and asked if she could come meet me for dinner that evening. Just the two of us, before everything got crazy with rehearsal and the rehearsal dinner. She said of course. We met at a small Italian place in town. She came in looking beautiful and tired in a good way, the kind of tired that comes from having a week full of things that matter. She had her hair up and she was wearing a blue sweater, and she looked so much like her mother that I had to look down at my water glass for a moment. We ordered, we talked, and then I put the folder on the table. I told her everything. I went slowly. I showed her the CFP board records. I explained what Nessa had found. I showed her the court filing from 7 years ago, the settlement, the pattern. I told her that I had spent 3 weeks trying to figure out how to say this, and that I was sorry I hadn't come to her sooner, and that I was not telling her what to do. I was telling her what I knew, and I was telling her because she deserved to know, and because she was the one who had to decide. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her. About 8 weeks. She looked at me. Her eyes were very still. She said, "Dad." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." She picked up the folder and started reading. She read for a long time. I ate about 4 bites of my dinner. A couple at the next table was laughing about something. Outside it was raining. When she put the folder down, her face had changed. Not broken, something else. Like a person who has just realized they've been holding something at an angle for so long they forgot it wasn't straight. She said quietly, "He asked me last month if I thought you'd be open to putting the lake house in a family trust. He said it was for estate planning purposes. He said it would benefit me eventually." I didn't say anything. She said, "He told me to bring it up with you." I picked up my water glass. She said, "I didn't bring it up because it felt weird. I couldn't figure out why it felt weird, but it felt weird." I said, "Your instincts were right." She was quiet for a long time. I watched her face. I watched her work through something enormous in a very small amount of visible space, the way she's always done since she was a little girl. When she was 7 and we told her our dog had to be put down, she went very still and then she said very carefully, "Was he in pain?" That's who she is. She asks the important question when it counts. She said, "What do I do?" I said, "That's up to you. I mean that. I am not telling you to call off the wedding. I am not telling you what to feel about him. What I'm telling you is that this information exists, and you deserve to have it." She nodded slowly. She looked at the folder again. She said, "I need to talk to him." I said, "Okay." She left right after dinner. I paid the check and sat there for a while. The rain had gotten heavier. I thought about my wife. I thought about what she would say right now if she could call me. I think she'd say I did the right thing. I think she'd also say, because she was honest, that I should have done it 3 weeks earlier. My daughter called him that night. I don't know everything that was said. She told me later that she asked him directly About the civil suit, about the complaints, about what he had intended to do about the lake house. She said he was at first confused, then defensive. Then he said Nessa was operating on incomplete information, that the lawsuit had been a misunderstanding, that the complaints were filed by unstable clients who hadn't understood their own portfolios. She said she listened to all of it. Then she asked him, "Did you ask me to bring up the trust with my father?" He said yes, but that it was genuinely for estate planning reasons. She said, "You were the one who told me which trust vehicle to suggest, weren't you? You laid out the whole conversation." He said yes because he was a professional, and he knew more about this than she did. She said that's the problem. She didn't call me until 10 the next morning. She said she'd been up most of the night. She said she had made a decision. She said it with the same careful, complete stillness she'd had at that Italian restaurant, and I knew the decision before she said it. She called off the wedding. What happened that Friday, the day before the wedding that didn't happen, is something I will never fully be able to describe. My daughter called 200 people. She called the venue and the caterer and the band. She called her closest friends and her cousins and my brother and my son. She was methodical, and she was composed, and she only cried twice, that I saw. The venue, to their credit, was kind. The caterer offered to keep some of the arrangements on hold. A number of guests said they were driving down anyway, and could they just come have dinner with her on Saturday night instead? We did have that dinner. About 30 people. A big long table at the same barn venue. Nothing formal. Somebody brought speakers and put on music. My son flew in from Phoenix and sat next to his sister all night with his arm around her. It was not a wedding. It was something better, I think, raw and real and full of people who showed up when it counted. He called her twice that Saturday. She didn't answer. She sent him a short message saying that she wished him well and that contact should go through her attorney going forward regarding anything practical. Then she put her phone in her purse, and she danced with my brother, who is a terrible dancer, and she laughed until she had to hold on to the table. Around 11 o'clock that night, she found me sitting outside on the venue's back porch. It was cool and clear, and you could see the stars very well out there, away from the highway lights. She came and sat next to me, and we didn't talk for a while. Then she said, "I keep thinking about Mom." I said, "I know, me too." She said, "Do you think she would have seen it sooner? She was better at that kind of thing." I thought about it. I said, "Your mother would have seen something in the first 5 minutes." She had a radar for people who were performing. My daughter smiled a little. She said, "I feel stupid." I said, "Don't. He was practiced. He'd done it before. That's not a reflection of anything about you." She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to do when she was small. I'm 63 years old, and I've built things and fixed things, and buried the person I loved most, and I have never once in my life felt as completely myself as I do when one of my children leans against me and trusts me to be solid. I said, "You know what I was thinking about last night?" She said, "What?" I said, "That photo of you on the dock. Your 7th birthday. You're wearing that paper crown, and you look like you'd rather be somewhere else." She laughed a little. She said, "I was mad because the candles blew out before I made a wish." I said, "Did you ever decide what you would have wished for?" She thought about it. She said, "Probably a dog." I said, "We got the dog 3 months later." She said, "I know. Mom said it was a coincidence." I never believed her. We sat out there for a long time after that. The music had wound down inside, and you could hear people talking and laughing through the windows, that gentle hum of people who came because they love somebody. In the months since that night, my daughter has done what she always does, which is move through things with a kind of methodical grace that I have always admired and never quite understood because I do not have it. She went back to her clinic in Asheville. She started hiking more. She called me every Sunday. Somewhere around July, she told me she'd started seeing someone new, a history teacher she'd met at a trailhead, which I thought was a very good sign, location-wise. She said he liked to cook, and he had 2 old dogs, and he did not ask questions about property. I said he sounded like a reasonable man. She said, "He is, Daddy. He's just a regular, decent person." It's kind of amazing how good that feels. The lake house is still mine. I went up there alone in June, which I hadn't done since my wife was alive. Just me and the dock and the 40 acres going back to the creek. I brought a cooler and a book I didn't end up reading. I sat on the dock in the early morning, when the water was completely still, and the mist was still sitting on the far side, and I thought about my wife, staining those deck boards in her swimsuit, furious and laughing about the raccoons, standing in that same kitchen making coffee at 6 in the morning because she was a person who woke up early and was glad about it. I thought about what we had built and what it had taken and what it was worth, not in dollars, not in acres or deed structures or estate vehicles or market values in the current Transylvania County real estate landscape, worth the way things are worth that you built with your own hands and your whole life and the person you loved most in the world. My daughter will inherit it someday. I hope that's a very long time from now. I hope she brings the history teacher and his old dogs, and has children who learn to swim off that dock and look unimpressed by their birthday parties, and grow up knowing that the things that matter are not for sale. Some things you protect because they're valuable, and some things you protect because they're yours, and because love built them, and because love is the only currency that doesn't depreciate over time.